Welcome to Larry the Alchemist, where we discuss all things heavy metal and hard rock. And on today's episode, I have a special guest, author and journalist, YouTuber and podcaster and artist. Martin Popoff is here, and he's here to talk about his new book, Kiss at 50. We're going to be talking about the book. We're going to also have a little general discussion about Kiss, maybe how influential was Kiss really in the 70s and the sound of Kiss and some other things. So, Martin, thanks for joining me here again at the Lair.
Absolutely. Yeah. Looking forward to this. Very cool.
All right, I'm going to be leaving a link down below to all information about Martin, where you can get the book, about his art, where you can see some of his art, his podcast, the YouTube channel, everything down below in the description. So Martin, tell us about this book, Kiss at 50. And this is your first Kiss book, right?
Yes, definitely. This is what it looks like. It's a big hardcover coffee table book with a slip cover and all that. And yeah, it's what the inside looks like. When you take the slip cover off. So basically the idea, it's like my AC/DC at 50. It's for motor books. They do a beautiful job over there, Dennis, in terms of curating the photos and stuff. It's full color throughout. Just very thoughtful photo selection and where things go. But basically I had to write about 50 career highlights of Kiss. And the hardest part of that is keeping the word count down so it all kind of fits. But yeah, 50 career highlights, all in chronological order. Hardcover book, available at martinpopoff.com. So yeah, my first Kiss book ever, and very timely, because obviously, yeah, in a couple days they're playing their final show ostensibly. So yeah, definitely got Kiss on the brain. Packing up a lot of these right now. Of course, I sign them, send them out from the office, all that stuff. Blah blah blah. martinpopoff.com.
Yeah, and Martin, his postage is very, very reasonable. So don't hesitate out there if you're Martin's in Canada, but if you're outside of Canada, don't hesitate at all. His postage is very reasonable and very, very fast. I don't know how he does it, but so when you're putting a book together, was there anything that's it's sort of being that this was the first Kiss book you put together? Was there anything that kind of surprised you or made you kind of think when you were putting together these 50 highlights?
Well, the cool thing about it is that being my first Kiss book, Kiss fans are notoriously angry and cranky all the time, and they love their Kiss. And there's a lot of scholarly Kiss books out there. So it was frustrating doing this because knowing that there is a set sort of idea with this. So I had to kind of make every sentence count. I'm just constantly paring it down, sort of thing. One of the nice things about doing it, I guess, was I did get to spout off all my own opinions as well, because what Dennis and Motor Books likes to do with these is make sure one of those highlights is every studio album and every live album, all that kind of stuff as well. So I kind of got to do a lot of reviewing and opinionating and all that kind of stuff as well. So that was definitely the satisfying part of doing this. Who knows? I mean, I might have another Kiss book or two in me at some point, but yeah, I mean, I hope it satisfies the fans. I mean, it is like I say, there's a certain mandate behind it, but I think one of the interesting things about it is that because it's done by a big reputable publishing company who has really nice design. It's you don't see too many actual kind of hardcover coffee table books that is completely from an external point of view as well. So just something about the vibe and feel of it just feels a little bit like a different Kiss book, like an objective, more of an objective Kiss book.
Yeah, it's tough with Kiss because their fans can almost be like Trekkies or something, where they're like super high level when it comes to like little details and stuff like that. And they're a band that, in the 70s, talk about a photogenic band. I mean, the live shots of them, I mean, you don't see any pictures of Kiss from the 70s of like boring, them standing against a wall or something like that. They always look good. And I remember seeing Gene Simmons once talk about how when they first got management and stuff like that, their manager would have them set up and play, and he would have a bullhorn. And his thing is that you have to constantly be, every time you're in the makeup, whether you're on stage and out in public, you have to be acting like you're going to be a poster on some kid's wall. And he goes, they would play in these rehearsals and the guy would blow the bullhorn if somebody was sort of drifting off or not looking cool for even like a nanosecond. And he said that that's been ingrained in them, that when they are in that makeup, when you're on stage, you are always on, you're always posing like you're in a photo shoot or something. And I think that's why when you see this old stuff of Kiss from the 70s, just so much of it looks good. You know, so many interesting pictures of them from the 70s and the makeup era, you know.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so you know, one thing that's that I've been thinking about lately is the influence of Kiss. There's and I think of it in relation to, if you go a generation earlier, people who were teenagers in the 70s who landed up being in bands, how often do you hear in an interview they say, the Beatles on Ed Sullivan? That's what got me into music. Now, the Beatles were on Ed Sullivan February of 1964. You go a generation later and you're talking 75, 76, 77 with Kiss, people who were teenagers during that era. I talk about it all the time on my channel. I had an uncle that was only 9 years older than me. So I was 7, 8 years old, 77, 78, but he was 18, you know, 17, 18, and very much into Kiss. There's a whole generation of people, musicians, that when they talk about what got them into music, how you hear Kiss, they were so influential. So many people say, like, yeah, they were the band that got me into playing music, much like the Beatles.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. I mean, and I agree with you. I probably have 20 of those interviews that wax rhapsodically about the Beatles situation, and then 20 more that talk about Kiss, right? You know, alive or seeing them on Midnight Special or something like that, right? And yeah, I think of the Anthrax guys. I think of, you know, Megadeth guys. You know, so the interesting thing is it's exactly guys my age and the guys who kind of started. You know, you essentially think of the guys who were starting to make their way, you know, up the rock and roll ladder in about 1983 kind of thing, right? So you had to be, you know, that would be 20 years old in 1983. You know, you were the right age in 1976, 77. You were joining the Kiss Army. So it was alive more than anything. And then, of course, it was Destroyer in a big way. And then Kiss Mania lasts for a total of kind of 4 albums during that era. So yeah, it was that whole amazing look. It was easy enough music to get to play those chords or bass lines or drum parts. And you know, everybody's got a story about dressing like them at Halloween.
Yeah.
You know, myself as well, my little brother. So yeah, it's definitely the whole package, the crazy live show as well, the pyro, the, you know, the leather and studs, all that stuff, being that absolutely crazy visual band. But I think, you know, even as kids, we knew, or at least, you know, I have an abnormally, you know, crazy music fan history. So it's good. What I like about Kiss and what I liked about writing this is Kiss is the first band that I could remember being on board for as a new release, as their first album, right? So 1974, 11 years old. I remember me and my buddies, I don't know if it was strictly me or a friend, but somebody got that first album as a new release.
Oh.
So we were on board right away with Kiss, right? And all along the way, and, you know, massive anticipation for when Alive was coming out and all that kind of stuff, right? But having said that, being crazy music fans, you know, even we knew at 13 or so, joining Kiss Army, the Kiss Army or whatever, you know, joining up, we already knew that it was in essence a different kind of boy band, right? They weren't a pop band, but they were a type of boy band as well. So even we were like, okay, this is not at the same level as Rainbow Rising or certainly Sad Wings or even or, you know, just one notch below Ted Nugent and probably 2 rungs below Aerosmith Rocks, right? Deep Purple, Black Sabbath. So we loved Kiss, but even already at 13, we had that relationship with them. Like, okay, this is kind of a guilty pleasure,
Yeah, yeah.
we're with these guys. We love watching the spectacle of this band being so massive and all this. And even then we remembered at 13, we remembered, boy, this is a long time coming, because they didn't make a lot of money in the previous incarnation across the first three albums, sort of thing. So yeah, it's interesting that you love Kiss and then you're there throughout all of the whole thing, but still it always felt, even to us, a little bit like an alternate new version of a boy band.
Yeah, that brings me to my next point, that they're so important to so many people, getting them into wanting to be in a band and stuff like that. Yet how many bands really sound like Kiss? How often, like we mentioned the Beatles, how often are you listening to something you go, oh, those are Beatles harmonies, oh, that's a Beatles melody line, oh, that's a Beatles chord progression, Black Sabbath has spawned whole genres of music, doom metal and stoner rock, where it's like, oh, that's Black Sabbath. Same thing with Led Zeppelin. How many bands you're like, oh, that's a Led Zeppelin ripoff? But when it comes to Kiss musically, how many people sound like Kiss from a musical standpoint, where you have some band that's like, oh yeah, you can hear the Kiss influence musically in their sound? To me, I don't hear that often. And I think part of it is because, what is the Kiss sound? Are we talking about Alive 1, which is kind of a little heavier? Are we talking about Alive 2? Are we talking about Unmasked and Dynasty? I mean, they sort of change their sound so much that I just find it interesting that they're like the most influential band that nobody sounds like. And I don't think they don't sound like them because they can't copy them, like, Yes, or some Rush or something, or some band like that. That's just because they're such phenomenal, unique musicians, people can't copy them. I just think it's a case of, like what you just mentioned, that people were more influenced by the package of the Kiss concept rather than so much musically.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, because, so first off, you're right. I mean, nobody really sounds like Kiss, but it's almost a little bit like nobody would dare sound like Kiss, because it's too simple, so their ego isn't satisfied as a musician sounding like Kiss, and B, that is kind of Kiss's territory. So it's lesser that, but it's kind of an interesting idea that this is Kiss's domain, this is what they do. But I remember growing up as a kid and always framing, um I'd say maybe the third and fourth and maybe the fifth Ted Nugent album, we always thought, oh, Ted Nugent's kind of like Aerosmith crossed with Kiss, meaning that it's
Mm.
got a little bit of that Kiss on the nose simplicity and a little bit of that Aerosmith complication, right? Um, and then, the other band that sort of dares to be in this kind of a lane that we talk about is AC/DC,
Yeah, yeah.
which is completely sort of simple like this as well. And then who else does sound like Kiss, and where do they get their influence? I mean, you hear them in the past talking a little bit about being influenced somewhat by Slade, right? And I don't hear a lot of Slade in Kiss, but I almost hear like the intent and the mania of Slade in Kiss, but not so much. Slade doesn't really give us the quality riffs that Kiss gives us. And when I say riffs, the funny thing about Kiss is that Kiss is more about that space between chord sequences and riffs. They don't really deliver a lot of riffs. And so the other band that I also think of and I compare them to is Heavy, Bachman Turner Overdrive.
Mm.
To me, when BTO is heavy, it feels like they've got a Kiss zone going, right? And BTO is kind of you could back them up and say they're a little earlier than Kiss, so there might be some influence there that needs to be explored a little bit, right? Like prod the Kiss guys, how much is BTO an
Yeah.
influence, right?
I can hear this Slade thing, like you mentioned, like in
Yeah.
a typical Slade type chorus, Mama, we're all crazy now, all that, those kind of shouted out loud, Kiss, that to me sounds like a very Slade like chorus, like you mentioned, maybe not so much in the riffing department. But you mentioned AC/DC, and I agree with you. They're both like from the same concept in that they're 3 chord bands. They're simple open chords, straight ahead chord rocking type of bands. But always the big difference for me between AC/DC and Kiss was the rhythm section. AC/DC swings. AC/DC has, and both Kiss and AC/DC are very much influenced. This is the other thing I find interesting about Kiss, that when you listen to their records, especially the first 3 records, how much 50s rock sounding stuff is on those records. Think about like Two Timer, Room Service, like songs like that. To me, they feel very 50s rock. Now, AC/DC has that too, the whole Chuck Berry type of thing. But AC/DC has a swing to their sound. To me, that's the rhythm section. That's the difference between Phil Rudd and Cliff Williams and Peter Criss and Gene. AC/DC has this sort of, they lock into that blues swing feel, whereas, maybe Kiss is a little bit more the more straight ahead kind of rock type of thing. I hear a little bit of Motown sometimes influence that time in Kiss, especially with the way Gene plays bass, the way he's always kind of doing these sort of walking bass lines, a la like Paul McCartney, for instance. That's another influence I would say I sort of hear in Kiss a little bit, maybe more so in the structure of like their vocal, the way they try to have the vocal harmonies, the way all the guys sing, 2 lead singers, John and Paul, Gene and Paul. And then you've got a singing drummer, Peter Criss, like Ringo, and all the guys have personalities. Paul Stanley's the romantic guy, Gene's the scary guy, Ace is the funny guy, that kind of thing. So yeah, it's interesting with their sound, where Kiss gets their sound from, and who does Kiss really influence. It's kind of, everybody sort of thinks of Kiss as this heavy proto metal, heavy metal band, but when you listen to the early stuff, man, I just hear a lot of like 50s rock and glam rock too by the time we get to like Alive 2.
Yeah, it's interesting. A couple things there. So I was quite surprised. I just did a recent episode of my History in 5 Songs with Martin Popoff, just the straight audio podcast, looking at the heaviest albums of the 70s and then also the heaviest live albums of the 70s, and how and what wins for the heaviest album of the 70s, right? Mm-hmm. And the winner, hands down by a long shot, pretty undisputed, would have to be, if you combined live and studio, would have to be Unleashed in the East. But looking at all the live albums, I was quite surprised at how heavy Alive 1 is. Alive exclamation mark is, right? It's actually, they put together a pretty heavy show on that, and then the delivery's pretty heavy. But so they are in this space. So yeah, just to kind of frame on this origins of American heavy metal thing that you and I have talked about before, right? As well. They are in a heavy space. They're almost like they've got all of that heavy BTO times 2 or 3, and then the production's way better and different, and more emphasizing the guitar thing. So they do have the heavy space covered. Now, this 50s thing is really interesting that you bring up, because again, and you and I have talked about this before, about the blues metal A/B switch that you get in America versus what we got with Black Sabbath, Deep Purple, Uriah Heep sort of thing, right? We do get it with Led Zeppelin, but not those other 3 bands, right? So what you get in a lot of Kiss songs, and Strutter always comes to mind, and there's a few other ones as well, but so I often use Strutter as the example where you have this band that almost subconsciously lapses into boogie rock dialogue, and then has the modern heavy metal riff, and then back again. So the Strutter verse gives you the 50s, and then the Strutter chorus gives you the modern new heavy metal, right? That we're moving on from Mountain and Cactus and garage rock and stuff like that. So they do that thing. And it's funny you brought up Shout It Out Loud, because this is another thing that might be kind of a cool episode of some sort, is the idea that Shout It Out Loud, I remember when that came out on Destroyer, and liked the song a lot, but didn't love it. And why didn't we love it as kids? So we're angry metalheads, right? So we love the verse, which is a heavy metal verse, and then they lighten up on the chorus,
Yeah.
right? And that's such a funny, interesting thing about heavy metal, where you can have songs that are like, okay, so we've got the heavy metal verse. Do we do a heavier chorus even than the verse, and then we move more into the heavy metal space? Or do we do a
Yeah.
lighter chorus than the verse, and then we move into the lighter pop metal space? So I'm not saying it's worth a study to go through the Kiss songs and see how often they go one way or the other, or how often they give us the pop verse and the heavy metal chorus, because I just brought up Strutter, right?
Yeah.
Strutter is one where you get the pop verse and the heavy metal chorus. So it's the opposite of Shout It Out Loud. Kind of interesting.
Yeah.
But also, when you say 50s, just as often they give us 60s, right? They give us 60s girl group or garage
Yeah.
rock, these various things. They don't give us psychedelia, but they give us girl group thing. They give us garage rock. So that all melds into the 50s thing too. And the other funny complication about the 50s thing is, when Kiss was happening, we were also going through a 50s revival, right? So you
Yeah.
got Shauna Na and Grease and American Graffiti and all this sort of
Yeah.
thing. So you've got that mixed up kind of a little bit in what they're doing. And I guess the final point I want to bring up on what you brought up is this whole idea about the rhythm section, right? And that got me thinking. I've never thought of this before, but quite often, a rhythm section that really baffles me, a couple that baffle me: Ted Nugent and Paul McCartney and Wings, okay?
Yeah.
And Eagles, for that matter. So there are rhythm sections out there that quite often just abscond of the duty of even being a rhythm section. Like, they've got badly recorded drums, terribly unimaginative drum parts, unimaginative bass parts. So Kiss does that sometimes, right? I think you get that version of Kiss on a couple of Kiss albums that I kind of start to denigrate a little bit in the last couple decades, that people love, which would be Rock and Roll Over and Love Gun. But you also get Kiss giving you better, well recorded rhythm sections, and more vigorous rhythm sections. And one of the great things from Kiss is that Gene often gives you those busy 60s ethic Motown related bass lines. So when I think of the rhythm section on most of Dress to Kill, for example, I'm hearing a really interesting, cool, almost AC/DC level rhythm section. But that kind of goes away, and we're back to a Paul McCartney and Wings kind of rhythm section when you get to Rock and Roll Over and Love Gun, which is maybe why I'm not liking those records so much these days. So, when you get, and they're not that well recorded. So when
Yeah.
you've got nowhere to hide and you're not really loving too many parts of the process, it allows you to be that angry Kiss fan and fall into that whole thing. Is like, well, this is stupid, right? I mean, I was for some reason I had to go back and listen to Shock Me, the heavy Ace song on those albums. And I'm listening to this going, I can't believe we actually thought this was heavy at one point, right? Because it's not
Yeah.
heavy compared to almost everything else from that era that we thought was heavy, right? It's like really kind of stonesy, right?
Yeah.
It's not that heavy, right? And yet we come away thinking it's one of the heaviest things Kiss ever did during that era. So yeah, that era is one that I'm starting to kind of look down on a little bit as I raise other, and I'm not the angriest Kiss fan in the world. I mean, I love all sorts of Kiss albums all over the place. It's just those two that people love a lot, I'm starting to like go, kind of a little overrated.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think the first three records, when they got to Alive One, they took the heaviest stuff from those first three records.
Yeah.
They could have just as easily have said, hey, you know what? We want to really hone in on this 55 to 65 rock and roll sound, and two timer and all that kind of like that kind of kissing time and all that kind of stuff, but Kiss Alive One, I think, leans way more, if you listen to that from top to bottom, like you said, it is pretty heavy. with Parasites, 100,000 Years, Rock Bottom,
Watching You, Deuce,
well,
Deuce,
Watching
all
You,
that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Parasite, Black Diamond, yeah, when you stack all those up next to each other, they are, yeah, they are pretty heavy. So it's interesting that but my problem with Kiss is that once you get to maybe between Alive 1 and Alive 2, after Alive 2, they start second guessing themselves where they don't know who they are. And they don't, from after Alive 2, in my opinion, they don't really have an identity. And they fall woefully behind all the other bands that are happening at the time. Everybody gets mad at me because there's so many. Everybody thinks I hate Kiss, and I don't hate Kiss. I love Alive 1 to Alive 2. My problem is that, again, when you look at like what was happening in 1980, where so many artists were like, it was like there was this collective change in the conscious thinking of all the hard rockers and metalheads, where everybody streamlined their productions and got a different, did away with all the jammy elements of the 70s and stuff, right? And so you were getting albums like Ace of Spades and Heaven and Hell and Blizzard of Oz and Back in Black, and you're just, 1980 is like this ground zero year. And what did Kiss release in 1980? Wasn't it Unmasked? Wasn't Unmasked 1980? Yeah. And they were still, by the time Kiss figured out what was going on with the new wave of British heavy metal, and they got around to it, it wasn't until maybe Creatures of the Night, which was what, 82, 83, so they were late to the new wave of British heavy metal game. They were late to the hair metal thing. By the time they got around to dressing up in pink outfits and doing hair metal, they were a few years behind the eight ball.
I'm going to disagree with you on that one, I think, a little bit, but we'll get to that. Yeah.
And even the grunge thing, it was like they were almost, to me, they start becoming reactionary. They start reacting to what's happening around them. They're late to the new wave of British heavy metal. They're reacting to hair metal. They're following it. Same thing with grunge. Grunge is happening around them. They feel like they have to follow this. So like after Alive 2, to me, it's like they're just throwing stuff against the wall to see what's going to stick.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the hair metal one is kind of interesting. You're right. I mean, they are following and they fall into it, but boy, do they fall into it, right? Yeah. So I wouldn't say that they're late to it, because they're essentially laying that groundwork with Lick It Up and Animalize, because 83 to 84 is ground zero for hair metal, and they're in there like a very clean shirt, right? They're essentially so yeah, I mean, on the wardrobe front, they become almost like so hair metal, they're almost a parody of hair metal. They literally have the best hair metal costumes relentlessly through that entire thing. So that's one thing they do. But also, being in there in 83, they are there, yeah, and with a perfectly absolutely fully formed hair metal album. They are right in there with Twisted Sister, Motley Crue. So they're a little later than Twisted Sister and Motley Crue, but that's not even really considered the proper hair metal. The proper hair metal is more like Quiet Riot, Doc, and Great White and Rat all together as a bunch, right? But by 84, when hair metal is kind of a year old, Kiss has got 2 albums under their belts with it, right? And they're right in there with Animalize and Crazy Nights and Hot in the Shade as well. And even they're even capping off the late period hair metal with Revenge by refusing to change for Revenge. I mean, Revenge is just like a go to Vancouver and try harder type, really good quality. Grunge has already happened. Grunge is old by the time Revenge comes out. But they actually give you a true hair metal album still, which is kind of cool. So I think out of all the 70s bands, Kiss kind of refound their calling, even though they did follow into it, but they realized that or they ended up being almost like the biggest spokesman of a 70s band being part of this. So they're the grandfathers of hair metal by participating so heavily in it in the 80s. And they're also the grandfathers of hair metal by being one of the main bands from the 70s that sets this thing up. It's
Yeah.
essentially Kiss, Aerosmith, Ted Nugent, and Van Halen, I would say,
Yeah.
that give you the building blocks for hair metal anyways. And then out of any band from that period, they are so into it that it's almost, like I say, it's almost meta. It's almost like a they're almost like a parody of a hair metal band.
Yeah.
During this period. And I like a lot of those albums a lot. And I think they do a good job and they have a career. And I always look back and think it's kind of interesting when, for a lot of time when the bloom is off and people are making fun of Kiss for having done this. Say you're in the early 90s or mid 90s and you're looking back at Kiss in the 80s, people just thought it was kind of a big joke, right? But the cool thing is in life in general, right? This applies as well. But, take that now forward 20 or 30 years and you look back and go, Kiss was working. They packed their lunch and went to work every day, right?
Yeah.
And they eked out however hard it was, and however people talk about all the tours not making enough money. They eked out gold records and the odd platinum record during that time. So they went to work and they participated fully and enthusiastically in the 80s. And now it's a big, important part of their history that all of us as Kiss fans who, endlessly, obsessively somehow find new ways to talk about Kiss all the time. There's lots and lots and lots of energy spent talking about Kiss in the 80s, where it once was sort of considered a bit of a joke. So you got to laud them for being this hardworking band that packs that lunch and goes to work every day.
Yeah, and you know what? Now that you say this, I'm going to take back a little bit of what I said about them in the 80s, because I do think that they're one of the, off the top of my head, few, if only, bands from the 70s, maybe Aerosmith. You mentioned Aerosmith, but where, yes, they got their start in success in the 70s, but I could have just as easily have seen them starting in getting their success in 85 to 87, 70, same as 75 to 77. Whereas I look at some groups and like UFO or Thin Lizzy or Uriah, I could not picture them, they just wouldn't. But Kiss, it was almost like they were hair metal before hair metal, but it was just that back then it was black leather and a little scarier outfits. And they were almost like designed for that kind of thing. But it's just that, well, in the 70s, they started off with the leather and the slightly scarier look. But by the time 85 rolls around, they're no strangers to dressing up. I guess that's what I should say. By the time the 80s roll around, getting dressed up and doing your hair and everything like that is not they're the guys that invented that, along with the glam metal rockers. So that's not a strange, weird territory for them. Whereas somebody like Ozzy or, again, some of these 70s UFO, Thin Lizzy, they just can't make that sort of switch over and all of a sudden become glam guys without it looking really, really silly. But Kiss was able to pull it off because, again, they're showmen and they're almost actors. They're showmen. They understand. They're the guys that invented the big, crazy stage shows, maybe along with Alice Cooper. Maybe there's another guy that was able to sort of switch over. Alice Cooper could have been successful if he had started in 85, just like he did in the 70s, because Alice was a showman and he understood the showmanship aspect of the rock and roll circus, the rock and roll show. It's just that in the 70s for Alice, it was scary horror stuff that could have just as easily in the 80s have been to an 80s aesthetic.
Yeah. And everybody kind of tried it to some extent, but nobody tried it nearly as much as Kiss. You think of Aerosmith, I mean, they're the big power ballad trope and the singer-songwriters and stuff. So everybody tried it in different ways, but Aerosmith kind of retained the complication and the ear candy and the heavy productions and all that stuff through that period and made creditable, good albums. But yeah, a lot fell on their faces. Ozzy kind of dipped his toe in it and then got out of it again, kind of thing. Scorpions kind of dipped their toe in it and got out of it. So AC/DC never really even dipped their toe in it, kind of thing. But yeah, Kiss absolutely did. Van Halen's kind of a funny one where it's like when Sammy joins the band, they're almost like being part of 80s fashion. but not even heavy metal 80s fashion. They're more like the other kind of, they're like Rush, right? They
Yeah.
they start like, adapting the look the same way Rush did. Like they're saying, oh, we're above looking like hair metal guys kind of thing. But we'll take all these other bits of 80s fashion, which are going to look equally as embarrassing one day, right? The whole
Yeah.
parachute pants look thing and all that kind of stuff, right? The suits, right? The Alex
Yeah.
Lifeson
The
suits and
bad
all that
fitting
kind of thing,
suits.
right? So yeah, the Miami Vice look. But and it's funny, as you were talking there about and relating to that thing you brought up, which was really interesting about rhythm sections, is again Kiss through this period in the 80s, again abscond of the rhythm section. I think they basically don't pay a lot of attention to how the bass, how much bass they're going to get out of the bass or the bass drum or the toms, or how much sizzle and treble they're going to get out of the cymbals, and building a proper rhythm section. To me, they're almost like a Tom Werman guitar locomotive through the 80s.
Yeah.
So yeah, they have this very strange sort of don't pay attention to what the drums are doing on these albums, sort of thing. It's all about the guitar chord slash riff sequence, the lyrics, and the vocals, and the rhythm section kind of just goes into the background. So yeah, they have a weird sort of identity through those 80s albums.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. All right. Well, there you go. Little interesting discussion here on Kiss. Let us know what you guys think about the Kiss sound, the influence of Kiss. How influential was Kiss in the 70s? Where do you hear the Kiss influence? Another thing, I don't really hear them with any other American bands at that time. Maybe, like you said, a little bit of Ted Nugent, but like Grand Funk and like some of those other, you don't really hear that in Kiss. But you let us know in the comments down below what you guys think about Kiss, the sound of Kiss, the influence of Kiss. Make sure you check out Martin's Kiss at 50 book. Looks awesome. All the links will be in the description down below, so you can go and check that book out. And thanks for joining me here again at the Lair, Martin. And I'm sure we'll see you again real soon.
Absolutely, very cool.
All right. See you, everybody.